Greetings, good people, and welcome back to another episode of Disability Inclusion Required. I'm your host, Justice Shorter, and I come bearing the best of news. We with disabilities still have the right to refuse exclusionary treatment. We're joined today by Eric Garcia, who shares precisely what this means in connection to recent attacks on individuals with autism. Eric is the Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Washington Correspondent at The Independent and the author of the book We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. He is also a columnist for MSNBC, has worked as an assistant editor at the Washington Post's Outlook section, an associate editor at The Hill, as well as a correspondent for the National Journal, Market Watch, and Roll Call. He has also written for the Daily Beast, The New Republic, and Salon.com. Garcia is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Let's get into it. Eric, welcome, welcome. We are so thrilled to have you here. How you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Justice. This is great. Thank you.
I appreciate that. So, listen, you are the author of We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. If you could be in conversation about autism with anyone from the past, who would it be, and what changes would you most wish to see come from such a discussion?
Oh man, there's a lot of people I would want to talk to right now, but I think that the one in the past I think would probably have to be Hans Asperger, who was the autism researcher in Nazi-occupied Vienna, and yes, he's the person who we get the term Asperger syndrome for. And what I would want to do is I would want to ask him, was collaborated with the Nazis worth it? You know, he was never, by all research accounts, it looks like he himself was not, a member of the Nazi party, but he was at least okay with the race science, and he was
Mhm.
okay at least with sending kids to their death. I believe it was a clinic where children with disabilities were often killed. So I guess I really would want to talk with him about, like, why? Why did you do that? Why? Like, was it worth preserving all your research to kill children?
And what change would you want to see come from that type of discussion?
I would wanna see, just more moral courage, because I think that there were a lot of people who resisted Nazis in, Europe at the time, and it was hard to do, but it was still worthwhile. It was something that, it could have shown a great deal of courage, and it could have offered a shining beacon and example for the children he was examining and for future generations how to stand up to authoritarianism.
Hmm. We're going to talk about that a lot in today's episode. I often say that discrimination can be found in the details, whether it is a corporate policy or whether it is a legislative effort that is being pushed forward by various members and lobbyists or governing officials. I want you to give us a brief synopsis of our landscape right now. How has discrimination against people with autism risen in recent months? And where exactly can that type of discrimination be found?
How many hours do we have right now, Justice?
Just a brief synopsis of whatever you want to give.
I mean, look, let's okay, fine, let's talk about it. Obviously the big thing is the resurgence of anti-vax sentiment with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. becoming HHS secretary, and with President Donald Trump, who's also an anti-vaxxer, believes that it has hinted that maybe it's vaccines that cause autism. Uh, so this is coming from the top. The call is coming from inside the house, so to speak. And so I think that's the big one right now. I think we're seeing the fact that, but it's not just the highest tiers. It's not just what they're saying. It's the policies that they're doing, the policies that they're enacting. Rolling back. Seeing something like Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency rescinding grants that are meant to research how autistic students transition into adulthood and get jobs, or National Science Foundation grants to help autistic people find employment, or research grants with the Department of Health and Human Services to reduce suicide amongst autistic people of gender minorities. These are all things I've written and reported on, and they are very real things. And I think that I think that it is a concerted effort not just to misinform, but actively disinform the public about autism.
And would you say that that is what perhaps feels so particularly jarring about the prejudice that's on display right now?
Yeah, it blows my mind, man, because the thing of it is that so I'll say this: my mom is a born again Christian. My mom is a Pentecostal Christian, and the whole reason I think that she never really thought not to expect much of me is that she believes to this day that I'm made in the image of God, and all humans are made in the image of God. And for a long time she was very conservative. She's kind of a moderate now, and, I always really admired that for a lot of Christian conservatives, treating people with disabilities was it almost bordered on a sacred calling. There was some paternalism in it. There was definitely some benevolent ableism in it, but at least I'd rather have benevolent ableism than whatever this is, and I think it's just jarring that you know, the science is settled on this. It's not like the 2000s where there were people going back and forth, and we didn't know that Andrew Wakefield, the guy who had put out that original study, had, lied about it. The science is settled, the science is clear. And yet we're doing this, and that's what blows my mind about it.
Mhm. As a writer and advocate who is immensely informed on current affairs, you have surely encountered the phrase, we need to change the narrative, a
Yeah.
comment that is commonly shared when discussing political engagement strategies or other efforts to combat bigotry. But how can changing national narratives around autism help or hinder those living on the spectrum?
Yeah, so I don't consider myself, and I never will consider myself, an advocate. I'm a journalist who writes about autism.
Mhm.
But I do believe to this day that including autistic voices in writing about autistic people can change people's attitudes about autism. So I think it's really important for me to interview non-speaking autistic people and portray the wholeness of their selves and their lives. Because I think that too often many people think of what Secretary Kennedy said, where autism, destroys lives and destroys quote unquote our most precious resource, our children. And he says that they can't go on dates or pay taxes or play baseball or hold a job, and that somehow that makes their lives less. And I think what I try to do is I try to include the voices of people across the spectrum to show that their lives are whole, yes, but also to kind of port you know, ask the question of what do they need, you know, and meet them where they are, and just, surprise, do what every journalist does, ask questions.
Talk to me a bit more, though, about when it goes in the opposite direction. When you have these national narratives that are actually quite dangerous and what seems nefarious and that could be deadly, ultimately, for the safety and well being of people with disabilities more broadly and folks with autism in particular. How do folks address that issue, tackle that concern around national narratives that are becoming pervasive and that are becoming problematic in the day to day lives of individuals with autism?
I wish I could give you a happy answer, but, the fact of the matter is that, look, I'm one reporter, I'm one reporter, thank God there are multiple reporters now doing this, and there are reporters who do that. But take into account that we can't compete with the algorithm. If something is on someone's TikTok for you page, or if something is on an Instagram feed, it's so much more difficult to push back on that. And I think that, yes, you can, it almost feels almost Sisyphean in a way. Like, just when you get the boulder up the hill, it rolls back down again. It's funny. I was talking about this with my agent. Um, when I wrote my first book, We're Not Broken, in the hard when the hardcover came out, I didn't mention Robert F. Kennedy Jr. once in the hardcover edition of the book. I only mentioned him once in the paperback edition, because I thought that in a lot of ways those conversations were over. My feeling was we were discussing too much about vaccines and autism, but the science was settled. So and I wrote in the book, I really tried to front end talks about vaccines just so that we could just say, okay, let's establish that this has been debunked, that this is not true, and let's move on. And so it's kind of dizzying to see. this kind of returned and also come back almost like in a mutated form, you know?
Speaking of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., let's talk about registries. We've been seeing a resurgence amongst government officials calling for autism registries. Can you dive right into it and explain why this concept is so deeply wrong, invasive, and dangerous?
Yeah, so, like, let's talk about it because, like, they released they released this, they announced it last week. So I think what had happened was, like, I guess 2 weeks ago now at this point, Jay
Constantly
Butter
changing. Things are constantly changing.
so let's is it okay if we get people up to speed on this?
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, what had happened initially was that President Trump tasked Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with looking at the root causes of what's the cause of the quote unquote autism epidemic, right? Even though it's not an epidemic, it's just been better detection and increased diagnosis, particularly for poor people, people of color, and girls. Um, so let's get that out of the way. Second thing that happened was Kennedy, gave a press conference about the new CDC numbers, the Centers for Disease and Control numbers that show that 1 in 31 children are between the ages of 4 and 8 years old are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. That was an increase from 1 in 36, I believe. And then what had happened was it looks like Jay Bhattacharya, the director for the set for the National Institutes of Health under President Trump, said that he talked about wanting to have like comprehensive patient data and broad coverage. This is what CBS News reported at the time, around autism spectrum disorder. And that, of course, raised a lot of alarm bells. And then yesterday, so as of right now, we're talking on May 8th. 2025. Yesterday was Wednesday, May 7th, and they announced, and I have the article that I wrote in front of me just so that I'm as accurate as possible. The plan is to have the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services collaborate to quote unquote link real world data in a way that is consistent with privacy laws to research chronic conditions. They said we're going to be using this partnership to uncover the root causes of autism and other chronic diseases. We're pulling back the curtain and with full transparency and accountability to deliver honest answers. And this, of course, raised a lot of concerns for a lot of autistic people because there was this fear of a registry. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker announced an executive order later to protect autistic people's data. I'm going to say something that might surprise you. I don't think the government collecting data, as long as there are strong protections for privacy, is necessarily a bad thing. The federal government collects data all the time on Social Security, on Medicare recipients, on VA claims. It's collecting data in and of itself is not a bad thing. I think what a lot of concerns people have is having these kind of merging of CMS and NIH data kind of risks violations of privacy. And I think especially we've seen this with the Department of Government Efficiency, where a lot of private data have not been handled with the utmost care. And I think also there's a fear that using this data, I should say this. I don't think that it would create kind of this autism registry. I think a lot of people were saying they're like, oh, autistic people are going to get sent to the camps or whatever. I don't think that's the case. But what I do fear is I do fear that data being used to justify focus on an epidemic of autism. I worry about that data being used in bad faith. That's what worries me the most.
I want to talk about how people can defend themselves a little bit and community protection because you spoke about protection and people being concerned and how folks protect themselves. So, how can neurodivergent folks really protect their bodies and minds during this time? And how can people show up for one another to keep each other safe? Listen, you mentioned about us not having control of the algorithms and there being a lot of things that aren't in our direct sphere of control, but to the degree possible, how can people get activated to support not only themselves but others with autism as well?
Yeah, really good question. I think a lot of it is literally really just about making yourself known in your community. Whether it's talking to your member of Congress, whether it's talking to your local state legislator, your state local official, making yourself known at PTA board hearings or PTA meetings or school board meetings. I think a lot of it is just about increased visibility, whether you're a parent or whether you're an autistic person yourself or a neurodivergent person. I think a lot of it is about protecting your peace. I think especially right now, there's this feeling of if you are not plugged into the news 24/7, that you're missing something, that you're almost being a bad citizen. But like the thing that I've learned, I'll give an example. Last year, I got sick. I got really sick I got a really bad flu and I got a really bad strep throat. And what happened is I was out of work for a week. And what was funny is I was so worried that I was going to miss a lot of news. And look, that's my job. I'm literally paid to follow the news. And I was worried that I was going to miss a lot of stuff while I was sleeping. And then what happened was that when I got back, after I got better, after a round of antibiotics and medicine, it was kind of just like riding a bicycle. I kind of was able to get back in it and get back on it again. And I think that that's the thing that I would say is like, look, the world is going to continue after, you take a nap, you go to sleep, you have dinner with friends, or you do something like, or you go for a run or anything, protect your peace. Like, you're not a bad citizen if you unplug a little bit just to clear your head. Like, I'll say this, over the weekend, like on weekends, I try not to focus on politics. I try to watch, I try to, I'm a big college basketball fan, so I'll watch college basketball. Or, right now I'm watching Andor, or I'm watching, or I try to find something fun to watch on television, or I try to go and I think that it's really or I try to see old friends, or I try to, play music with friends or whatever. Like I really try to protect those corners in my life in a way that I normally would. So,
Mm. And you've touched on this already, but I want to give you room to expand even more. So I want to stay on this protection path. There is no shortage of disability specific programs and rights that are under threat of being cut or even completely eliminated by the current administration, right? You talked about this. So, how can both advocates and funders mobilize in ways that are proactive, right? Rather than us constantly being on the defensive, how can folks moving away to your sports analogy, moving away that is more on the offensive, I guess. But also tell me, how could this work can be done in ways that protect the most marginalized organizers from political retribution? Because that's something that is actually stopping a lot of people from making movement around this. The fear that their family member who is undocumented may be targeted, or another family member, or perhaps themselves who rely on government assistance or support programs may be targeted, or they'll be cut off in some way from another critical service. So, what is your message to those folks? How do folks mobilize and still get activated on these issues?
yeah, I mean, I think that one of the ways that you do is you just like everybody has to know their slice. In like I've always said this before, like you don't have to know everything, but you have to know a lot about something. You have to know something really well. And I firmly believe that with my bones, and get as educated and get as informed as possible and learn the most up-to-date information and knowledge about that one specific thing and try to focus on that. And, if you kind of, so to speak, devour this whale, I think that is really the way you get really informed. And I think you also make sure that nobody's overloaded, and I think that you also take into consideration, like, okay, this might not be something that other people are able to do, but this might be something I'm able to do. Like, I think burden sharing is very, very important.
Hmm. You started this conversation off by busting a few myths. I don't know if you remember. I think there used to be an old school show called Mythbusters back
Yeah,
in
no,
the
no,
day.
I was a fan of that show
They're
when I was
busting myths around autism. So I want to give you a little bit of space here. Are there any other myths that you would just like to bust or break through right now in this conversation that you want folks to just keep top of mind?
yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I would say really easily is that, like, autism is not something. I think we still have this idea that autism is seen as something that is only a white person's condition. When, historically, what we've seen is that the reason why we've seen the increase in numbers is that, and this is a good thing, that more Black kids, more Asian American kids, more Latino kids are able to get a diagnosis, but we still think of it as a white person's condition. But specifically, we tend to think of it as a white boy's condition. When really, this is something that affects girls as well. We just miss a lot of those traits as well. The other thing I would say is that, like, we have this idea that if an autistic person needs around the clock care, or that they have higher support needs, that their life is somehow lesser,
Mhm.
that it's less fulfilling, when oftentimes it's not that. And look, I don't want to diminish the real needs that people have. I'll be the first one to say, like, look, we like Medicaid is severely underfunded for this stuff. But by setting that bar so low and saying this is all they can accomplish, you're really limiting what they can do. It's funny. I've met non-speaking autistic people who have graduated from Berkeley. I've met, non-speaking autistic people who, write poetry and who vote. I really do think that this is I really have seen these kinds of things. And look, again, I don't want to diminish the real needs and the real challenges. And it's specifically because of that that I want those needs addressed so that they can have a good life.
When we talk about some of these myths and the resurgence of a lot of these really detrimental ideologies around autism, it makes me think about a common refrain that many people have been coming back around to, which is the idea that listen, a lot of this discrimination is a distraction. And the goal or the objective is to tire folks out or to remove people's focus or attention from some of the other pressing needs. I want to get your opinion, your thoughts on how people sustain themselves long term, even though they have to react in real time, quite honestly, to crisis after crisis after crisis that are man made.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And like, how do folks do that? Any advice that you just may have?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I know a lot of people say that X is a distraction or Y is a distraction. I really think that all of them, they really genuinely believe all this stuff. I genuinely do. But again, I think a lot of it is to borrow from, I grew up in church and I still am somewhat, yeah, I still have my faiths and my beliefs. I just don't shove them down people's throat. Is focus on running your race. Focus on what, again, I keep going back to this and I know I keep on saying this, but like focus on the thing that you feel you are gonna be able to change. You don't need to change everything. And actually that's kind of a relief. When you realize you don't need to change everything about the world, but you can focus on changing one thing, that's liberating, you know? Then all you need to do is just focus on that thing. And so what I would say is like you don't need to constantly be up to date on everything. But if there's something that really matters to you, focus on that.
Mm. I want you to close us out via this following prompt. If you could write a letter that every young person with autism would open in 4 years, how would you begin and end that letter? What would be your opening sentence and your closing sentence? And what would you say to initially get their attention? And what would be the last thing you say that would ideally stay with them for a lifetime?
I would begin and end the letter the same way, which is saying that your voice is valid, whether it is through a keypad, whether it is through your vocal cords, whether it's through whether it's through a letterboard. Your voice is valid and it must be heard, and it is something that you deserve to. It's something that deserves to be amplified. So I don't think that you have to. I think that more than anything, what you need to do is you need to find the way to make your voice heard, however that might be,
Mm.
and not be ashamed of it. That's how I'd begin and I would end it.
Eric, it has been a pleasure. I'm so thrilled to have you end it on that point. Thank you so much for joining us in Conversation for Disability Inclusion Required.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
You take care.
You take care too.
If you want to keep your learning journey going, visit the Disability and Philanthropy Forum at disabilityphilanthropy.org. I'm Justice Shorter, and this has been another episode of Disability Inclusion Required. Thanks so much for tuning in, and join us again next time.